Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me to listen to me talk to you about the business genius of the Grateful Dead. Now, it used to be not too long ago that I would talk about the business genius of the Grateful Dead to folks in corporate America, and I'd get strange looks. That's kind of changed, though, certainly in the last year after an article appeared in the Atlantic magazine just about exactly a year ago, March 2010. It was talking about the management secrets of the Grateful Dead, and it featured a number of my thoughts and ideas that I've been working on over the last 25 years to try to understand what it was that appealed to me about the Grateful Dead, and especially their business practices. Okay? So the Grateful Dead kind of present us with a strange paradox. Here they are, a rock and roll band, and could they possibly have lessons for corporate America? Well, I think they do. I teach, I have a PhD in business. I spent 20 years in corporate America, so I have both the practical side and the theoretical side about business, I think, to help understand what it was that the Grateful Dead did and what I think they can show corporate America. When I teach business classes, leadership, strategy, so forth, a lot of the case studies that we look at are aimed at large Fortune 500 companies. That's all fine and good, but there's more small businesses and medium-sized businesses certainly than the Fortune 500. So I'm not sure that all these case studies about Southwest Airlines and General Electric and so forth are necessarily applicable to today's environment. I think that students are bored with those kinds of things, especially the Gen Ys that are coming up right now. And I wonder also if the lessons that we get from those cases are applicable to the new normal that we find ourselves in as a result of the economy and rampant change and crises emerging all over in every industry all the time. The Grateful Dead also survived a very turbulent industry, the music industry in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Okay, they were successful for 30 years. They stayed together as a core group. The same core musicians stayed together for 30 years, very successful. They grew from $50 a night to in the tens of millions of dollars a year in income. And they had some important lessons, which I want to talk to you about today. And I think that one of the most important things about the Grateful Dead is even though they haven't performed for over 16 years, they more or less anticipated the internet age, and I'll elaborate on that here. So why am I telling this story to you about the Grateful Dead and their lessons for business? Well, as Jerry Garcia put it a long time ago, he said, you know, a lot of people don't like licorice. He says, but the people who do like licorice, they really like licorice. And I'm one of those folks who like Grateful Dead licorice. And I've become more a fan of Grateful Dead licorice over the years. My first exposure to their music was in 1968 with their first album. I didn't much care for it. I didn't like their licorice. But the more I listened and the more I began to see them perform, and I saw them perform 194 times over 21 years, believe it or not, clearly they had something that attracted me to come back, and that's what I've been trying to articulate over the last 25 years then, is what was it that they were doing, why is that important, and how can it be adding value to corporate America today? So I worked for IBM for a number of years. I worked for John Deere Company. I own some small businesses of my own, so I have some practical experience in business. In the 1980s, while I was working for John Deere Company, I could see the change that was occurring as a result of a downturn in the farm economy. I could see the changes that John Deere, who was 150 years old at that time as a company, had gone through, and I could see the challenge of change. So I wanted to understand how can organizations change more effectively? Can they change more effectively? And so I've been studying that for the last 25 years then, thanks in large part to the Grateful Dead. In fact, I was so enamored with the idea of trying to understand what it was that they were doing that I quit my job at John Deere and I went back to school as a full-time PhD student to study organization change. Okay? So I've spent a lot of time studying the Grateful Dead, change, and corporate America, and let me tell you what I've learned. Strategic improvisation is a term that I've coined and was first appeared in print in this Atlantic article a year ago in 2010. And strategic improvisation is the way that I apply what the Grateful Dead did musically to the business world. Okay, the Grateful Dead were a business after they were a band. They were musicians first, and so they were artists. And what they did then, their musical style was improvisational. They learned from the jazz masters, even though they were a rock and roll band. John Coltrane, Miles Davis were huge influences on their musical style. So every performance that they played, every single concert that they ever played was unique and different. It was different every single time because they were improvising. They were creating something in the moment every one of the 2,316 performances that they played. Okay, so creativity, innovation, and so forth. And in order to maintain that integrity of those performances on a regular basis for 30 years, they needed an organization that would support that and not smother it. Hierarchical command and control kind of a business model would not have worked for the Grateful Dead. As a result, the model that they created was much like their performance. Teamwork, communication, sharing the leadership, embracing others' ideas, consensus decision-making. These are all elements then of strategic improvisation, being able to turn on a dime and maintain creativity, innovation, and adaptability. The second thing about the Grateful Dead is their staunch belief in core values. They grew up in the 60s in the San Francisco Bay Area, the epicenter of the counterculture, and their values were based on some things that kind of looked down on at the time by corporate America, even today to some degree. Love, peace, harmony, those were the basic values. And they were careful about living these values. They really believed in these values, and so they eschewed the typical corporate America model. Not only because it would smother their creativity as a musical organization, but because they just thought that it was more important to do something to move the planet and humanity forward. Very ambitious goals, but that's what they believed in, and that's what they did for 30 years. Okay, they also had a very strong focus on their customers. They provided the greatest customer service of just about any organization I've ever run across. And as a result, they created lifelong fans. They did this by allowing their fans to tape their performances, by allowing them to borrow the logos that they had copyrighted and put them on t-shirts and memorabilia and so forth. And they were one of the first bands to really encourage this whole merchandising thing, and they made a lot of money as a result of it. Those lifelong fans attended lots of concerts, like me, 194 times. Okay? And they provided the best concert experience there was by investing in the technology of sound reproduction. They had the finest sound system in the world and spent tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars of their own money doing research and development to make sure that the fan in the back row had as good a sound as the fan in the front row. Okay? So they also, as I said, they shared their content by allowing fans to tape their music. They allowed fans to put logos on t-shirts and sell them in the parking lot, because this tightened up this community then, this virtual community who, even though I lived in Kansas City, my best friends were spread out all over the country, and I'd meet them at concerts. And this was the Deadhead community, something that they nurtured and created a tribe then of customers. Been very successful, and this is another emphasis right now of the internet age, is trying to create an online virtual community. The Grateful Dead were there long ago. Embracing technology, as I said, they spent a fortune on their sound system, their lighting system, and all of this had to be able to withstand the rigors of constantly moving from venue to venue across the country. They were never in one place very long. Unlike the Rolling Stones or the Beatles or any of the groups that have survived today, the Grateful Dead were a touring band for 30 years. I could see them 194 times because they were there, because they were always performing, unlike the Rolling Stones, who got on tour every 5 to 10 years when they need another $10 million or so. So they embraced technology, they lived their values, they embraced their customers, and here they are then, this unusual paradox. They're a paradox because they were a rock and roll band, and I'm comparing them to corporate America and suggesting there's important lessons there. They never strove for success, certainly not financial success, but they were successful. They only had one top 10 single hit, and that was number 9 in 1987, A Touch of Grey. It rocketed them into the stratosphere in terms of audience attendance, which became a problem ultimately, but they solved that too by listening to the Deadheads and responding to their feedback and suggestions. Even though they were anti-business because of their core values and growing up in the 60s in the hippie community of San Francisco, they became business geniuses without realizing it. Okay, they had no business plan. In fact, they didn't even want to use that term business. We're not businessmen, we're musicians. That's very true. But a lot of planning had to go on in order to keep them on the road for 70 to 80 concerts a year for 30 years. Okay? They anticipated this emergence of give your content away on the internet today. Free, the power of free, okay? And they created this improvisational business model, which is also very relevant today in the 21st century, where you have to turn on a dime, respond to unexpected crises, Okay. Finally, they wanted to move the human race forward. They wanted to make a planet a better place, so they created their own corporate social responsibility before there was such a thing. The Rex Foundation gave to grassroots organizations, continues to do so today, even though the band hasn't performed for 16 years. They created an experience culture. It was all about going on tour and seeing something and living something right there in the moment with the Grateful Dead and their performance. It wasn't about selling records. They weren't that successful selling records, but they were sure successful selling tickets. So these are the lessons then that I wanted to share with you today. There's more of them in my forthcoming book. Everything I ever learned about the business, I learned from the Grateful Dead.